Okay, Chapter 7, Environmental Policy. So we're going to start off with the case study here. This one's all about fracking. You may know a little bit about fracking, and we'll come back to this in Chapter 19, but this case study tells us a lot about fracking. We have fracking going on in a lot of states. This one highlights Pennsylvania. And hydraulic fracturing, which is done to retrieve natural gas, which is the cleanest fossil fuel, or petroleum. There are several positives associated with fracking. For one thing, natural gas actually reduces emissions, so the fact that we're using more natural gas is a good thing. We actually have more of a supply of natural gas, so the cost of it will go down, the demand. We can reduce coal use by using more natural gas instead of that coal, so it's more efficient for the environment. We have employed a lot more people with fracking. There's a lot of money for landowners. If you actually want to sell your property, they find out you have natural gas below it, you can get tens of thousands of dollars to give rights to your property to actually frack. There's also some negatives. When fracking was actually exempt from NEPA, which is a law that says you have to do an environmental impact statement before you're allowed to actually drill on public land. And that was a huge thing. They don't have to create these impact statements. So essentially whatever happens to the land, nobody has to worry about. They're exempt from the Safe Drinking Water Act. So we actually, 12 years ago we started fracking, we exempted them from this law. So they don't have to fit any of the policies and guidelines of Safe Drinking Water Act. So anything that spills back into an aquifer, they don't have to be responsible for. Different companies use different chemicals, and they don't have to tell us what those chemicals are. So if they're using it on your land, there's a chance it can get into your water source. Farmers are actually getting chemicals and carcinogens, as well as natural gas in their water. So some people actually have the ability to light their water on fire. Some places actually have radioactive waste pools that have just been sitting there that don't need to be cleaned up. They've actually found an increase in earthquakes as well in places that have never had earthquakes, like Oklahoma. Scientists are saying that that's due to fracking, but fracking companies have come out and said, no, it's not us. Since companies won't disclose the chemicals that they use while they're fracking, we don't know what to look for as well in water quality testing. What are the new chemicals we should probably be cleaning more for, and so on. They also have to make sure that you read through the image and the captions to see how fracking actually works. So they go through this a little bit, and they teach you how fracking happens. So Garrick Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons is something that we talked about several times, but basically it's an essay written about how unregulated use of resource leads to depletion. Examples of commons are stuff like rangelands or grazing properties, the ocean that we use for food, air and water, even water that's, the fact that we don't have water during droughts, forests for lumber, clean air, water and recreational use. Those are all different commons the forest can provide. So what are solutions to prevent tragedy of the commons? Those are regulations like laws, quotas, and limits that we are starting to develop. People don't regulate themselves, so we actually have to create laws to set up and regulations on things. So let's talk a little bit about the waves of environmentalism. The first wave of environmental policy happened in 1860s through the 1900s. Environmental policy doesn't necessarily mean protecting the environment. This portion of our time was not about protecting, but it was more about conquering nature. So we started to do westward expansion, and Western land was considered to be infinite. There were some laws passed during this time, one of which was called the Homestead Act of 1862, where we settled the prairie lands, and essentially that biome is relatively gone right now due to the fact that so many people went out and settled and created their farmland and turned it over. The Mineral Lands Act of 1866 gave free mining to public land to anybody who actually wanted to do it. They didn't have to pay for environmental cleanup. This law is actually still around. It wasn't taken off the books. So if you wanted to, you could just start mining on public land. The Timber Culture Act of 1873 cut down the forest, and we really didn't have an idea that we could destroy nature. We thought that it was infinite. We thought it would replenish itself. We could expand our economic power and our power as the United States, in comparison to the rest of the world. But we actually ended up doing a lot of damage to the environment, and we did it really fast. We realized we were in trouble. You've probably seen Rachel Carson and heard about her book called Silent Spring. You should remember that from freshman year biology. She wrote about the spring, basically there were no birds, which had a great deal to do with the wide use of DDT, which is a pesticide, and its biomagnification through the food chain. And this resulted in the decline of larger bird species. We'll come back to her again because she's more in the modern portion. But the second wave of environmental policy was really trying to mitigate the problems, fix the problems from the first wave. This happened at around 1900s. People started to preserve land. The forests and prairies were disappearing, so they decided that they needed to preserve what was left. They started to do this in the 1900s with the onset of national parks and wildlife refuge, as well as forest reserves. The third wave, which is the modern wave that starts in the 1960s with like Rachel Carson and a couple other people and extends into today, is really where a lot of the laws were created to address the a lot of the laws were done to address pollution, and those went into effect, like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, also the Endangered Species Act. We started to ban products like DDT that Rachel Carson wrote about and a couple other ones. Another big component that pushed a lot of this lawmaking was the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. This river caught on fire a couple of times, at least 3, and this really brought to light that industries should not be able to dump chemicals into water supplies. This is really starting to become nasty. It brought to the forefront the importance of protecting the environment and our water. So it really started to get things shifting for the Clean Water Act and a bunch of other ones. A couple of laws passed at this time. NEPA is a law. It's a National Environmental Policy Act. If you're going to use public funds or public land, you have to create an environmental impact statement before you can do that. So you want to go build a highway, you need to have an impact statement. What's that going to affect? How's it going to affect it? How are you going to remediate? Are you going to lose this much biodiversity? Are you going to regain it? So on and so forth. The next big thing that came around this time was the EPA, which is an agency. It's the Environmental Protection Agency, and they enforce the laws that Congress passes. Congress has to pass the laws, the EPA then enforces them. EPA cannot make laws, so again, they have to be passed first by Congress, and then the EPA can take care of it. This next page has some of the laws that AP wants you to cover. The ones that you should know are these 10. Some of them show up a little bit later in this chapter, but you got the Clean Water, Clean Air, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, Endangered Species Act, and CERCLA. Those are actually on the page before. Then we get into solid waste disposal, cities, Kyoto, Montreal, and the Delaney Clause. And a few of these you might have to look up on the internet. A couple are actually on pages in the future here, like right in this section, as well as down below. So you can take a look at those. You don't have to know the years of any of these, but you should know what the law actually says. So we're going to flip forward. You need to know what a subsidy is. Basically, a subsidy is money from the government, either from a tax break, tax credit, or some other resource that's free, like a road. It makes products that are artificially cheaper because taxes actually pay for a portion of that product, so it's subsidized. Gasoline is one of those things, and oil. If we didn't subsidize oil, gas would actually be a lot more expensive for us to purchase. Another thing we subsidize would be corn, wheat, soy, and those products produce stuff like corn syrup, which is in pop and popsicles and all that, which makes pop cheaper than it would be at real cost if we actually didn't subsidize the corn that made the corn syrup for the pop. People actually say this is probably part of the reason why we have high obesity rates in this country, because a lot of the unhealthy things that we eat and consume are actually the stuff that's subsidized and therefore is a lot cheaper. So cheaper is what people purchase. Cheaper isn't always great. Other stuff like coal, roads for logging. Essentially, these roads were built through national forests and were called fire roads, but then all of a sudden they were used by logging companies for free. Good subsidies, one in particular is PV cells or photovoltaic cells. They have a great rebate on your taxes if you actually put them on your home. and sometimes those like Star Energy appliances. We have those. Last thing that we have is cap and trade. And this is a marketable emissions permit. This is a way for companies to reduce their pollution. So we actually set a law that says, the Clean Air Act, you're only allowed to use, let's just say, 10 units of pollution. But maybe your company's super efficient and only uses 5. You can actually sell or trade the other 5 that you don't use to companies with maybe dirtier and more inefficient plants. This allows us to then reduce greenhouse gas as well as water pollution and air pollution. And it gives some incentive to those cleaner factories, but also allows some of those other factories to continue working in those developing countries that might not have the resources to have more efficiently run factories. So that is the end of chapter 7.